Hi, this is Dave in the IQ Center with another tutorial on Cinema 4D. Today I want to talk about painting and texturing in Cinema 4D. This is similar to a tutorial that I've already done, but it's updated for R21, and I'm also including texturing instead of just painting. So let's jump into Cinema 4D, and I'll set up a little scene that we can paint on. So first of all, I want to just throw a couple of objects in here. Let's throw an oil tank in our scene. And I'm also going to put a platonic in there. I want to have a couple of objects so that I can show you how to paint on individual objects and how to create a texture that can paint on multiple objects at one time. So I've got two objects. One thing I'm going to do first is to make these objects editable, and I'll explain why later, but let's just go ahead and do that. I'm going to press C to make these editable, and you can see by the little triangle icon that these are now editable objects. And we're going to go into a layout called BP 3D Paint. That stands for Body Paint 3D Paint. Body Paint is the texturing system within Cinema 4D. So you see we have all these different modes. We're going to go into 3D Paint. You see everything changes. We've got different icons across the top, different icons across the left, and we have a little bit reconfigured objects panel. So if we go on the upper left or upper right, if we go into the Objects tab up there, this is similar to the Objects tab that we had before. So in order to paint on something, we've got to make a material. A material is basically just it's a square bitmap, like a Photoshop file that that gets wrapped around your object. So we have to make this material, apply it to the object, and then we can paint on it. So to do that, we go into the Material tab next to the Object tab in the upper right, and we hit Create. And then we hit New Default Material. Now this is a way to create a material that can be applied to a single object, and this is sort of the manual way. Later on, I'm going to show you a sort of automatic way. But so we create a material, and you can see that it's got a big X by it. That means it's not active. So we need to make it active, and now it says it has one channel, which is a color. It's got a C next to it, but it's still, we don't have an actual file to paint into yet. So we have to double click this X below the color channel. And when I do that, it brings up the new texture dialog box. And this is where the file that gets created that's going to hold our color. And so right now, I'm not sure what it defaults to, but this is what I used last. Color material channels need to be powers of 2, and they're normally referred to as 2K or 4K, and so a 2K is 2048. So it makes 2048 by 2048, and a 4K texture is 4096 by 4096. Depends on how much detail you need to paint, how big these things need to be. I'm going to just stick with a 2K texture, and it lets you here pick a default color as well. So we can choose a color. I'll maybe make something a little pinkish, and I click OK. Now it makes a material that is pink and it's 2K, but it's not on anything. Nothing has changed in our scene. So what I need to do is take that material and drag it onto one of the objects. So if I take this material, drag it onto the platonic, you see that it has colored the platonic. Now this material is applied to that platonic. And it's all over the whole thing. And right now I can paint directly on it. Right now I'm painting with just color. You can see that color has got a little white pencil by it. That means that it's active. And the color that I have selected is in this little white box here. If I click that, it'll bring up the color tab, and it tells me, and it lets me use the color picker to pick a new color. So if I want to paint on that with a blue color, I just select a blue color, and that's going to be my active color. And if I go zoom in on my object, you'll see that there's a paintbrush and a little circle. That's the brush and the brush size. And you can, at the top, I'm in 3D paint mode, and on the left, I'm using a paintbrush. So there are fill buckets and gradient tools. It's a lot like Photoshop. So if you're familiar with Photoshop at all, this should be very familiar to you. But I'm going to use a paintbrush, and if I click on the paintbrush on the left, it brings up the paintbrush properties in the lower right, in what is normally our attribute manager. And you can see that there's a size slider, there's a pressure slider, and there's a hardness. How, if you turn it from, if I make it large, you can see the hardness is how soft the edges are, and then we have, and then we can also change the size by clicking the middle mouse wheel in the viewport and dragging left and right. That also changes the size. And now if I just click right on my object, you can see that I'm able to color. I can turn my object around and color it on any side. Okay, so that's a simple mode where we can apply a texture to a single object and paint on it. And if you want to see what's going on behind the scenes, you can click this texture tab. This will show you how the polygons are laid out, and you could see that was not quite right. If I go to Object, I have my oil tank selected. If I select the platonic and go to Texture, it will show you my painting that I just did, and it also shows how the polygons of the platonic are laid out on our square texture. So our texture is a square bitmap file, and it's a three-dimensional object. It has to be unwrapped, and that unwrapping can cause problems from time to time. And this is one of the reasons why we make our files editable. With parametric objects, you can't see these polygons in here, and you also can't apply textures to multiple objects when they're and you can also paint right on this too, but the results can be unexpected. If I make a solid line across several of these things, you can see when I go to my texture that sometimes those polygons aren't actually next door to each other, although in this case they were. But anyway, so you can paint on here, or you can paint on the texture itself. Okay, so that's sort of the manual way. You create a material, you apply that material to an object, and then you paint on the object with the material. Another way to do this is to use the paint setup wizard, and that will work with multiple objects. If you have a complex object that's made up of multiple things, that might be a preferable way to go. So what I'm going to do, well, let me stop right there. There's another thing that I need to make you aware of, and that is that this texture will need to be saved. It's a separate file from your Cinema 4D file, so we need to save our project and our material whenever we move these. So I'm going to go ahead right now and save this Cinema 4D project. I'm going to go save project as, and I'm saving it in this location that you will have access to, and I am going to call it material test. And when I do that, it's asking me, do you want to save the changes, or you want to save changes to the textures of the project? And I definitely want to say yes, because I want to save this material. And what you will see is that it saves a file. I mean, let me bring up a so it saved our Cinema 4D file, and it also saved a file called mat_color_1.tiff. That's the texture. That's a file that contains our painting data. And if I double click that in a picture viewer, you can see it's actually just a regular TIFF image. Another thing I want to show you here is where that texture lives. So if we go into our material, you see if I click the material, it brings up the material properties down here, and you can see in the color tab, that's where it references that TIFF image right here. And if we were to change that in Photoshop, for example, we would need to come in here and select reload image. Or if we wanted to load in another texture, we can load it in here. Okay, let me quickly show you the paint setup wizard option for texturing objects. I'm going to go ahead and delete this texture completely, so we're starting from scratch here. And what I need to do is just click this these three stars, and this will bring up the setup wizard, and it brings up a list of all the objects in your scene. And this can be quite extensive. There, you could have a scene that has 100 objects in here. And what we want to do is put a check mark next to every object that we want to paint. So let's say this is a little more complicated. We might want to have a single texture that allows us to paint on multiple objects. So we put checks next to our two objects, the platonic and the oil tank. We hit next. It's asking me how to calculate the UVs. This optimal cubic mapping has worked pretty well for objects that are mostly convex. This is a little more complicated when you have a bunch of objects. But what this is referring to is how does the 2D object get mapped onto the 3D shape? And we can check it out, and if it doesn't work, we can try it a different way. So we're going to do optimal cubic mapping. I'm going to hit next, and then this is where we put in the size of our object, or the size of our texture. So and we did 2048 last time. Let's do that again. 2048. We'll put that in the minimum and the maximum. And here we can put in a default color. Do the same thing. This time I'll make it make it a green color. And then I hit finish. Now you can see what happened is it went through all the steps for us. It made a material, it made it active, it applied it to the entire object, and it's right here. So it's called matte. And now we can start painting directly. Now here we can try to see what it, how it laid out our objects. So if I go to texture, you can see this is how it laid out the texture for the platonic, and it's a little different, and this might yield some unexpected results because some of these triangles are different shapes than others. So if we try to put a circle onto each one of these, it might not work out exactly right. And then the other one that we're looking at is oil tank. So here's platonic, here's oil tank, and you can see that it has spaced them out. So it has, and if I select, it doesn't let me show them both at the same time, but if I select one or the other, you can see that it has taken all the polygons from the two objects and spread them out and not overlapping on the entire texture. And you can see since I painted on the platonic, it's that painting is on those polygons. So that's how you make a texture on two objects at once. Okay, now let me talk a little bit about painting with textures. So I'm going to go find a texture, and this can be anywhere. This can be like a Google image search. Here's a Google image search of just for collagen fibers. We can save this file to a disk, and then we can go load from disk, and we can go find that. Here's that image from Google. I can open it. And now that is that's in our color channel. And we can also put that in our bump channel. So let me go to bump, texture, load from disk, open. And now we can paint with that, just the texture, or with color and texture. So if I go back to materials, turn off color, I'm going to rotate my model around to do a different side. Now if I color with just bump, you can see it's coloring with just, it's coloring with that collagen pattern. And I can make that larger or smaller too. If I go to, this looks grayed out, but under materials, if I go here and make the scale smaller, it might be more what you're after. So now we have, and we can paint not just the texture, but we can paint the color and the texture. So if I go to materials, hold the shift key down, turn on color and bump, and I think I need to make it even smaller. I think I need to make the scale even smaller. So let's go to the other side and go to our, and I also need to make the scale the same for both of them. So let's do this. Let's go here, scale 16%, and make this 16, so they're both the same, and then paint on there. So now we have a texture and a color painted on. Okay, and then when we're done painting, we can just switch back to standard layout or startup, and we can see our object in the scene. One thing you'll notice sometimes when you go back to the standard view or switch textures, it doesn't look as good, and that's because the default preview on the textures is low to save on computer power. But if you want to see what it's going to look like, you can click on the texture in the texture manager on the lower left, and then in the attribute manager there is a tab called editor, and you'll see that the editor default preview size is set to default, and you can drop that down and set it to what you chose for your texture, which was 2048 by 2048 in our case. If you click that, you'll get a more accurate view of what the texture looks like. Okay, another thing that we can do is we don't have to go into body paint if we want to texture an entire object with a pattern. Let me show you this. If I just bring a I don't know, let's bring a capsule into our scene, and I'm going to bring it over here, make it a little larger. If I just want to put that texture all over the whole thing, we can just make a material with a bump map in it. So if I double click and make a brand new material, let's make a material that is I don't know, let's make this blue, and under basic we can add a bump channel And we can load an image into that. So we can go bump. I can load image. And this time let's load green cells. This is a picture of some cells. Now when I go to add this texture, it's saying that texture I just loaded is not in my project path, and do I want to put it there? And this is a really important point. If I'm basing my texture on a bitmap, that we want that to be saved with the project. So I'm going to say yes. That's going to put a copy of it, and you can see a sort of a preview of our texture right here. And we can choose what size it's going to be. So you see the strength of our bitmap. So this is a kind of a cellular structure. And now if I just take that material and drop it on my object, you can see that it has made a texture there. Now we can increase the quality by doing that same trick. Now one thing that we can't do is decrease the size of it. We can't without making it editable. So if I take this object, the capsule, and make it editable, making the object editable adds a UVW tag to the object, and that allows me to select the material up here in the as it's applied to the capsule, and then I have access to this information about how it's applied. And you can see that it's saying length U, length V. That's how long it's going to be in the height and width, and then these tiles. So this is how many times is this image going to be tiled around my sample, and by default it's going to be 1. But if we want it to be smaller, we can increase the number of tiles. So if I change this to 2, you can see it's run the material around twice. And if I change that in V, I can make it smaller. So the higher I make these values, the smaller the texture. And so now you see we're just applying the texture. Let's make this 3 by 3. And then I can also put that same material in the color channel as well. If I want to color with not just the texture, but I want to color with that material, I can go to my color, or to my material, and select the color tab. And in the color tab, I can add a texture, and I can load image, and I can load that same green cell file. It's asking me, do you want to put this in the path? And I say yes, absolutely. And now you see it is. Now we not only have the bump, but we have the color as well. But you can also see easily this is not an evenly repeating pattern. When you add the color in, you can really see the edges of that object. But sometimes that doesn't really matter. Okay, so there are some options for painting objects with textures and colors with materials. Thank you for watching.